Okay. Let's wait one more moment. Okay. So before we start, I want to make one point. I think there was a misunderstanding. I hope not. Because I noticed that in the morning class, there are very few, not the usual number of students. I hope you realize that the morning class was a regular morning class. This one is the one that's going to be recorded and posted on Blackboard. So just in case there was a misunderstanding, I'm going to try at various points to sort of repeat some of the major points that I made this morning regarding Kafka. What I didn't do this morning, I'm going to do now, is I think this is actually going to work. A very short introduction, short documentary, the biographical introduction to Kafka. So it'll give you an idea also of his background and the city of Prague, where he was born and grew up and so on. So if you missed it this morning, you get to see it now on this short documentary, which is part of the lecture that is going to be recorded. So let's start with that. Can you all hear it? Because there was a problem in the past with the volume.
Oh, Professor, here is something I might have a solution to that.
No, I think can you hear it?
And did you broadcast it on your side and we hearing it through you?
Can you see it and hear it?
We can see it, but I'm not sure about the hearing part since it's very blurry.
Because it's very loud.
Oh, Professor, I think I have a solution. So when you go to the bottom, right, there's a share screen. And once you click on it, there's a bottom left corner. You can see there's a option.
So can you hear it?
Professor, let me just explain to you. So there's another way we can hear the volume without you raising your volume.
Okay.
So you go to the share screen at the bottom. There's a green button, right?
The share screen is...
Click on it.
Yeah.
And you can see the option, right? Like which screen you want to share.
No, it doesn't. New share screen, honest.
All right. Yeah, click on that.
Okay.
And then the bottom left corner, you can see there's an option that share computer volume.
Ah.
Correct? You click that.
I did. Ah, great. Thank you. Now, how do I get back to where I started?
And then let's try again. Then play.
Okay, let's try it. Can you hear it now?
Interestingly, no. Wait, Professor, did you click a new share or are you back to the old share?
Can you hear it?
Yes and no. We can hear it playing on your side, but we cannot hear it directly.
But if you can hear it and see it, that's, I guess, as good as we're gonna get. Can you at least hear can you hear what's happening on my? Can you hear what's happening on my side?
Very blurry. Wait.
Oh, by the way, Professor, what is the name of this movie? Hello?
Yes.
So what is the name of this movie?
It's not a movie. It's it's the famous authors series.
Okay. Could you type the name of this? Maybe.
Professor?
Yes.
Can you see the screen that I'm sharing right now?
Yes.
Yes. So this is what you're looking at, right?
Yeah.
And there's this picture, and once you click on the screen share, and there's a button say share computer sound, then share, and I think that might solve the problem.
Share computer. I thought I already did that.
But you had to click share instead of closing it.
Yeah, but now it's not.
Maybe you can control the screen of the professor.
Wait, just 1 second. Let me get my daughter.
Mhm.
Okay.
Do you mind letting me share the screen?
Yes. So the problem is, Professor always he'll assume that we can only hear it through his side, but there is a way to share the sound without blasting it on his side.
You can't hear it?
N-
Let me show you. Like, let me try and tell me if you can hear something. Write in the chat if you can hear.
Now the beautiful capital of the independent Czech Republic, it was at this time part of the huge Austro-Hungarian.
The sound is very slow. I'm sorry. It's low.
Sorry, did you hear that?
We hear that, but it's not clear. It's like the background sound.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
I mean, so what we just heard is you guys blasting it on your side, and we can just we can barely hearing it. And however, there is a way to share the sound without you guys without actually needing you guys to turn the volume all the way up on your side.
Okay, so what should I click?
So you can see the bottom share screen, correct?
Yeah, share screen.
And you click on it, you can use there and see how many screens you can share.
Oh, share computer sound?
Yes. I mean.
Okay. Let's try it again. Hold on.
The German-speaking
Yes. After 3 months. Yes.
Okay.
education was to be in German. So Kafka was to grow up speaking Czech to the servants and German at school
Let me move
and
it back to the
work.
beginning. Oh.
Wait, Professor, before we start, you don't have to blast it on your side. We can hear it clearly after
Okay.
Franz Kafka was born in June 1883 in a house on this spot in Prague. Now the beautiful capital of the independent Czech Republic, it was at this time part of the huge Austro-Hungarian Empire. The local language was of course Czech, but the German-speaking emperors had long ago ruled that education was to be in German. So Kafka was to grow up speaking Czech to the servants and German at school and work. Kafka is unusual amongst writers in that his name is probably even better known than his work. We describe as Kafka-like a situation where the individuals in a society or a work situation are beginning to lose touch with their individuality and disappear into the anonymity of humdrum office life and bureaucracy, or the life of a mass and industrialized society, where people see themselves only as cogs in a wheel. Kafka was obsessed by his childhood and the terrible effects he felt it had had on his outlook on life. His father, Hermann Kafka, he considered cold and unfeeling. Hermann had had little or no childhood himself. He was the son of a poor Jewish butcher in an outlying village, and he had come to Prague as a peddler to make his way. By the age of 31, when Kafka was born, he had succeeded. Jewish, yes, in ancestry, but otherwise he spoke Czech at home and German in business, and had little to do with the Jewish faith. By 30, Hermann was rich enough to marry Julie Loe, daughter of a wealthy class Jewish brewery owner. Her German-speaking father was a strong supporter of the emperor and of Jewish assimilation into Austro-Hungarian society. However, her mother died when she was young, and she was brought up by an unloving stepmother. Julie was always very warm-hearted, but probably married Hermann because it would be a safe situation for her. She had her eldest son, Franz, about a year later, and she was 27. Hermann's wholesale and retail dry goods store shop was in the bottom part of this huge building on the main square of Prague. The incredible architecture of Prague very quickly makes you feel rather small and unimportant. It is easy to feel that even if you lived here all your life, like Kafka, you are only a passing trace of no importance whatever. The apartment that Kafka settled into was just round the corner from the square. This doorway is all that remains of the original building. The street on the left leads to what was the Jewish quarter. On the right towers the Christian church of St. Nicholas. After Franz came two more boys in quick succession. However, the first of these died by the age of 3, and the second lived only a year. So the delicate 5-year-old Franz had to look on as his mother fell into a frenzy of grief over the deaths of her sons, which probably affected her for the rest of her life. Like all elder children, he had resented the arrival of his brothers and wished them gone. And then they were gone, and his parents mourned, and he felt in some way responsible. It is intriguing to note that around this time, Sigmund Freud, who did so much to establish psychoanalysis and attempt to explain the working of our minds, was growing up with a remarkably similar background. Freud was born in a little Czech village in 1856. His Jewish textile merchant father went bankrupt, and the family moved to Vienna in 1859 when Freud was 3. So when Kafka was born, he was just 13. Both of them were in the rising Jewish middle class. Like all tribes and religions, the Jews tried to control the education of their children in the way of their beliefs. If they did not, the beliefs died. The Jews also stuck to their own language, Yiddish. They tended to live in the same areas of town, and as minorities were sometimes forced to do so. When it comes to getting a grip on your followers, the Jews have always been big time. However, in 1763, a revolutionary decree by the enlightened King Frederick of Prussia announced that henceforth 4 years of primary education were to become compulsory throughout the land. He was an absolute Protestant monarch. He claimed to have his power from his God, and everyone in his country had to do what they were told. Of course, such education brought dramatic results. When people learn to read and write, they are never the same. The huge, rambling Austro-Hungarian Empire included not just Austria and Hungary, but Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Romanians, and a host of other minorities. The Empress Marie-Thérèse, this is a memorial to her in Prague Castle, was a staunch Roman Catholic. But many of these people were breakaway Christians like the Calvinists and Lutherans, and then there were the Jews. She was desperate to find a way of unifying her disparate peoples. So, following the example of her cousin Frederick, the Empress hit on a powerful and effective solution to her problem. In 1774, compulsory education was introduced throughout the empire, and it was to be conducted in German, no matter what the religion of the child. Of course, it worked to a huge degree because the business of government throughout the empire was conducted in German. If you wanted a government job, you had to speak German. In 1782, the empire went even further. In generous terms, they announced that Jews were no longer to be segregated in any way. All jobs and universities were to be open to them. Just to be on the safe side, if Jews wanted to marry, they had to have an elementary school certificate. In German, of course. Of course, Jews married just like everyone else, so the German language schools quickly filled up and taught less and less about the Jewish religion. The Jews integrated and spoke German. To this day, Jews argue about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. All this meant that by Kafka's day, although there were still Orthodox practicing Jews in Prague, this is their city headquarters, the vast majority were German-speaking and assimilated. Hermann Kafka didn't speak Yiddish, didn't practice Jewish rites, and saw his business as business with the people of Prague, and his Jewishness as history. The Kafkas moved house quite a few times as they became more successful, and finally settled in this house right on the main square. The boy was 6, and he lived here for the next 7 years of his life. The ancient designs on the walls were covered by whitewash in his time. School was in 2 parts: elementary school until he was 10, and secondary school. In both he was a successful pupil, and the teachers approved of him. He loathed them and feared them, however, and the only thing that meant anything to him was the friendship of his schoolmates. The secondary school, or gymnasium, was on the 3rd floor of this building, called the Kinsky Palace. The students learned Greek and Latin for 1/3 of the time and memorized lots of it. Otherwise, they learned some mathematics, geography and history, and had 2 hours of religion. In the opinion of one of the students, there was absolutely nothing that equipped them for life outside. Life at home had produced 3 sisters. Perhaps this kept his mother a little busier, and in later life he had 3 persons who were part of his family, at least. But life at home also meant his father, domineering and demanding, and his mother constantly supporting her husband to the neglect of her children. She apparently played cards with him every night of their life, and she supported him in his business life most effectively. None of this did much for Kafka. Any attempt to make life in Kafka's Prague seem simple is doomed to failure. As he was going through the gymnasium, the main matter in Prague was language. If you spoke German, then you supported the empire, and you were seen as anti-Czech. But of course, he was at a German-speaking school. He was sent there. He didn't choose it. Also, although his family didn't practice the Jewish religion, everyone knew he came from Jewish stock. People who spoke German got on in life because that was the way the government had arranged things. Naturally, patriotic Czech speakers didn't like it. It was impossible to avoid being categorized, castigated, condemned, even beaten up for just being who you were and not opening your mouth. This atmosphere was the world in which Kafka grew up. Kafka knew doublethink from the inside. He understood the operation of corruption, nepotism, and unfair influence perfectly. In the fair streets of Prague, where Mozart had strutted his stuff and architects and builders had outdone themselves in glorious structures, the human beings who lived there were contorted and twisted to such a degree that it took a Kafka to depict it all, and happily to begin to sort out the tensions. Another major factor was having an effect. In the whole of the empire, nowhere was so effective at industrialization as Bohemia, of which Prague was the center. So people were becoming rich. Factories were booming, and people poured in from the countryside to work in them. Naturally, well-educated, German-speaking Jews were in the forefront of these commercial developments. Yet another reason for anti-Semitic feeling. Kafka may have loathed his school, but he fortunately had his friends. As far as finding people of like intelligence and interests, he was lucky. One boy in particular, Hugo Bergman, had been Kafka's classmate from the first days of school. Bergman was always top of the class and sailed through all the academic institutions they attended with ease. Bergman was also a totally committed Jew and a Zionist. This last meant that he felt the Jews must establish their own state in Palestine, the land promised to them by their God. Kafka was totally opposed to all this, but their differences didn't prevent them being close friends until university, and good friends thereafter for the rest of their lives. At the age of 14, Kafka declared to Bergman that he was going to be a writer. Another close friend was Oskar Pollock, in his class at the gymnasium. The friendship between Pollock and Kafka was close, intense, and almost passionate. Pollock was the first person to whom Kafka showed his early writing. Pollock was very mature for his years and much more sophisticated in his tastes and knowledge of art. He was just the person to help Kafka to look at the wider world outside Prague and see the provincial limitations they were living in. Of course, they lived in a totally male world. Women were either the female members of one's family, and so untouchable, or the women of the streets, available so easily for the middle-class young man to pleasure himself. In the uncertainties of such a restricted adolescence, it's not surprising that the Pollock-Kafka relationship had a homoerotic tinge to it. Kafka recognized it and thought nothing of it. For him, Pollock was nothing but good. Who else among all the people he knew could be trusted to read his writings with sensitivity? Pollock went on to a career in Academe in Italy, then was killed in the Great War, fighting the Italians he so admired. There's no doubt that such a sensitive person as Kafka would have had a complicated life under any circumstances, but in the Prague of his day it was a nightmare. He went to university and began to study law. Of course, the University of Prague was as bad as anywhere when it came to lecturing, and he was bored to stupefaction. It was no more than he expected. What he did not expect was Max Brod. Brod was about a year younger and in temperament the exact opposite of Kafka. He was an optimist, and his delight in life never wavered, in spite of a hard early life and some physical deformation of his back. This very outlook attracted Kafka, and the two became firm friends. If Kafka was educated, it was not the fault of the institutions he attended, but through his own efforts and the contact with friends such as Pollock and Broad. Broad was as optimistic and convinced of his friend's talent as he was that life was worth living, and if it had not been for Broad, it is likely that Kafka's work would have remained unrevealed to the outside world. For Kafka, graduation from law school came with a doctor's degree and a job with an insurance firm. Kafka ought to have been grateful, but he was still only interested in writing, and within 6 months he had left his post in the grand building of the company and joined another government insurance company where life was easier. And after 1 p.m. he was free to work on his writing. This was his main consideration. He was able to earn an income enough to give him time to write. It was a major plank in Kafka's view on art that what an artist produced had to be free of the taint of the need to sell it. It's always been a problem with artists. If nobody wanted to buy his work, then that was fine. It didn't stop him writing it. With his insurance job, he didn't need the money to live on. Mozart had the same problem. He tried to give up playing the piano for a living in order to write music. He was always hunting for the patron who would pay him and then let him get on with composing. However, the hours in the office took their toll on Kafka's health and his spirit, already tending well towards depression. In fact, he apparently did the job well. Over the years he was there, he got rises in salary. He was given special commissions. But the whole system of bureaucracy he saw as soul-destroying. Corruption, idleness, sycophancy, nepotism, it was all there. Perhaps if he had not had his job, we would not have had the legacy of books we do have. Via Broad, 1 or 2 short stories got published. Over long periods of time, he struggled over the 3 novels by which he is now known. A writer such as Kafka, whose background was so tortured in its social framework and even in the family in which he lived, obviously writes powerfully from the experience he knows. But when you read his books, there is absolutely nothing personal in them. So it is the work that matters. About the rest of Kafka's life, 2 aspects seemed to corner him, and his being unable to get the better of him, his life came to what we must regret as an early end, with no huge amount of work behind him. Firstly was the matter of his health. He never felt he was fit. He was perfectly aware of the relationship between the state of his mind and his physical well-being. He knew that good diet and exercise were what he most needed, and he put himself through endless regimens of physical fitness. This was a great time for physical fitness in the German-speaking world, keen to make itself the master race. And, of course, dieting. So extreme was he in his attitude to what he ate and how he ate that his family was forced to see him chew his food many times more than normal. It was the advice of an American doctor whose work he had read. If religions could make huge food fetish demands on their followers, then he could do even better. It was never a question of will. He had plenty of that. By the time he got tuberculosis, striking him as arbitrarily as it struck anyone else, then after the strains he had put upon his body, it is not surprising it was hardly able to cope. Then there was his problem with women. He fell in love often enough and longed for the happy married life he saw his sisters have. But the women he loved were immediately goddesses, who were in the end unapproachable, or for whom he was not good enough. Freud would have had a field day, and Kafka himself was constantly seeing through the impossible demands he made on these relationships. He always saw himself as ugly, when in fact he was tall and handsome and even graceful. Everyone who knew him spoke of his essential nobility of character and his gentle tactfulness and sense of humour. Remarkably, he was also intensely practical when it came to ordinary affairs, and many people benefited from his advice. Perhaps this accounted for his success in negotiations between workers and employers in his insurance cases. It is hardly surprising, then, that women were attracted to him. He almost married 2 women. Felice Bar was one of these. She treasured his letters to the end of her life. But these affairs were no sooner commenced than, certainly to the bewilderment of the girls, they began turning into the sort of tortured nightmares his stories depict so well. Eventually, he found reasons to break off. Apart from these personal matters, Kafka lived through the First World War in all its awfulness. He was not fit for service, but he lost friends like Pollock. He could see more clearly than most the disintegration of the old world values of Europe. In any other writer, it might be astonishing that there is no direct reflection of the terrible events through which he lived in his work. What concerned him, however, was the individual. He flatly refused to see the world in terms of mass movements of belief or race or nationality, or even of going to war. In his writing, there is no trace of his background. What mattered was that a person knew nothing better than him or herself, and the struggle of life is with one's own identity and those around you. Astonishingly, he wrote a book called America, though he had never been there. It's about a young man's struggle to establish himself from scratch in a new world. But of course, it could be anywhere. It has nothing to do with the tribe you are in, or success in terms of money or power or position. You shed your baggage and get on with being yourself in universal and human terms. Occasionally, Kafka traveled to neighboring capitals like Berlin or Vienna. In Berlin, where Felice Bar lived, he faced the agonizing decision about whether or not to become engaged and then marry in the accepted bourgeois way, or to scuttle back to Prague and his own private world and not commit himself to the settled married life he so much desired on the one hand and feared on the other. He wrote many short stories, 2 quite long ones, Metamorphosis and The Penal Colony, absolutely horrified many people who read them, and they are characterized by the cool, unemotional detachment with which they depict horrendous situations. When Kafka wrote, all the confusions and difficulties of his life seemed to fade away. There are few writers who can equal Kafka for the supreme confidence and clarity and the almost deadly precision with which he wrote. In his next novels, The Castle and The Trial, the heroes, modest individuals, are pitted against systems. They approach the systems with common sense and logic, and they are met with totally illogical certainties. It is an astonishing picture of the way the world works. Kings, emperors, dictators, rulers of all sorts from time immemorial, and for a whole medley of reasons, have gained control over the rest of us. After Kafka, that control can never be the same. In the last few months of his life, a young Jewish girl of 19 set herself to live with and look after the now dying 40-year-old Kafka. And there is no doubt it was one of the happiest times in his life. Dora Diamond was perhaps the first person with whom he felt he could just let himself be. Kafka's illness was, of course, incurable at this time, and he died a painful death, unable to swallow even the meagre diet he required. He died on June 3, 1924, in a sanatorium in Austria, and was brought back to be buried in Prague, at the time unpublished and unknown. Fortunately, there was the incredibly industrious Max Brod, himself already famous and the author of numerous published works. He had always been aware that his friend Kafka was a writer in a class of his own, and he devoted himself to editing and publishing Kafka's works so that the rest of the world could judge for themselves. He also wrote the first biography of Kafka, an invaluable and very personal portrait. Not surprisingly, the Nazis, when they came along, banned Kafka's writings. Hitler's illogical and deadly systems were the perfect embodiment of the systems Kafka's heroes met with. However, his books were translated into English and other languages and gradually seeped into the mainstream of world literature. It is now clear that no artist or inquirer after the world's values in any field today can ignore the work and the vision of the astonishing Franz Kafka. Kafka was a totally committed writer who published little or nothing in his lifetime. His close friend Max Brod edited and published his work after his death, and what we have may be divided into three groups: miscellaneous pieces, short stories, and novels. Miscellaneous pieces. Kafka's diaries were certainly not meant for publication, but because they exist and they throw a somewhat tortured light on his character, they've been published. Reading them, one has to remember that people tend to write more about anguish in a diary than about joy. The letters to two of the women in his life, Felice Bauer and Milena Jasenska, are also published and reveal the other warmer sides to his nature. Short stories. Available in various complete editions, they include two long stories or novellas, Metamorphosis, about a man who turns into a beetle and the effect this has on the people around him. The Penal Colony is an astonishing story about a torture machine and how brilliantly it works. Chillingly, the inventor takes just the same pride in its effectiveness as a baker takes in the good bread he bakes. Novels. Kafka wrote 3 novels, all really unfinished. This doesn't at all detract from their magnificence. America is his first book, and is at times quite comical, and although its hero goes through some hard times, it has its warmth and charm. Kafka never went to America, but in his book it is a sort of promised land which turns out to be a challenge. In The Castle, a man goes to take up a job at the castle. What the job is exactly, and who his employers are, is never clear to him or us. But his efforts to make a go of it are full of richly developed scenes, which are totally convincing and quite spellbinding. Finally, in The Trial, a man is arrested on charges which are never really made clear, and he goes through a never-ending struggle to understand how he finds himself in this situation and how a verdict can be reached. All the time, like the hero, you feel the answer must be in sight. Logically, of course, there is no end to this story, but it's a journey worth taking. The essence of Kafka's work is to be found in the novella Metamorphosis. After you've read it, much of the writing and drama and filmmaking of our own day becomes clearer. The novel The Castle is not finished, but it's written with such power that you long for the hero to make it somehow, and so you become part of the story yourself. Kafka writes with complete clarity, so his work is not at all difficult to read or understand. We can take comfort from the knowledge that his heroes never give up.
Okay, now let me see, how do I get back to being on the screen? Let's see. Uh-oh, have I lost you? Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, sorry about the, I don't know why I disappeared on the screen. Okay, so I think it was a pretty good intro to Kafka, and I'd like to sort of start with the end, because that's really where we're heading this morning. He wrote those two novels, remember, The Castle and The Trial. And in The Castle, as they pointed out, the individual who's seeking employment, or he's been summoned to the castle, he's a land surveyor. And he gets up early one morning and he's off to do his job, whatever that is. He never makes it. In The Trial, the main character, Joseph K., is awoken one morning with a knock on the door and told he's under arrest. Now, what did he do? Well, he has to find out what he did or didn't do. And that's what the whole novel is about. He tries to find out what, what's this indictment? What did I do wrong? Now, remember, we looked at the parable Before the Law in the morning, and it's posted on Blackboard. And what that parable was all about was that in Kafka's world, you have to understand something. There's a moment in time when you can change your whole world around. If you take that opportunity, you're a positive figure. If you don't, you're a negative figure. You're a guilty figure. But regardless of whether you do or you don't, you're doomed to failure in the end. Because in Kafka's world, there's no redemption, right? We're all guilty and we're all doomed. But at least you have to make the effort, right? And so that's sort of the overriding and universal message of Kafka. Now, it was pointed out in this documentary that there are very few personal or autobiographical elements in Kafka's writing, as it should be, because these are universal statements. This is about mankind. This is about modern man. And as was pointed out at various points, modern man suffers the fate of being an anonymous, alienated, unrecognized, and marginalized human being, right? That's the product and the consequence of industrialization in part. And of course, in Kafka's case, there's also the personal element. But in general, in the modern world, human beings are, just not afforded the value that they should be. It's interesting that in one part of this documentary, they talk about World War I. Now, World War I was probably the most significant event in modern history. People don't really understand the significance of World War I. But the whole world changed with the First World War, and there would have been no Second World War had it ended differently. But the fact of the matter is that World War I was the first total war. It was a war in which every kind of unimaginable horror of modern technology was used to wipe out incredible numbers. 10 to 11 million people died in World War I. And that was followed, by the way, by a pandemic, right? 100 years ago, followed by a pandemic, the Spanish flu, another 5 million people dead. So already the notion of mass death, of numbers that are unfathomable, kind of added to the notion that human life just wasn't anything particularly unique. Add that also to the industrialization issue, and then, of course, what followed in World War II and the Holocaust and total destruction, annihilation of human beings. By the way, there was the Holocaust in World War I, the Armenian genocide. So human life was totally frittered away and devalued to a point that no one could even begin to imagine. And that's the world that Kafka describes. That's why, in part, he's so popular, because he's managed in his bizarre and surrealistic way of describing circumstances and stories that really cut to the core and the nerve of what modern life is, of what the modern world is. And so that brings us to the metamorphosis. And we'll spend a bit of time on this. Again, this is being recorded, and I'll let you know how you get to it. It'll be posted actually on Blackboard, but I'll let you know exactly how. So the metamorphosis, as they pointed out, is probably his most famous work. And it is a typical Kafkaesque narrative in which there are certainly autobiographical elements. So the relationship of Gregor Samsa and his father clearly, echo the relationship of Franz and his father Hermann Kafka. But if that were all it were, it wouldn't be worthy of being canonized as a great piece of modern literature, because it transcends that. It talks about a greater issue and the marginalization of mankind in a massively productive economy, but also in which the world, in a new way, I mean, this always sort of exists, but in a new way was confronted with the notion of totalitarianism. I mean, granted, there were always absolute rulers. There were monarchs, absolute monarchs. But you know what happened after World War I? After World War I, fascism emerged in Italy with Mussolini. Nazism emerged in Germany with Hitler. Communism emerged in Russia with Lenin right in the middle of World War I. That's when the 1917, the Russian Revolution, at the end of the Russian participation in the First World War. So now the world is defined by these absolutist, totalitarian, dictatorial regimes. And that's what human beings now suffer under. That's, they are pawns in a great chess game under which they have no control, right? And that's basically sort of the universal message that comes out of Kafka. So that brings us to this interesting story, the metamorphosis. And we looked at the first paragraph. We'll start again. When Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself changed into a monstrous cockroach. Again, not a good translation. The German original is Ungeziefer, which is just a bug, big bug. He was transformed as a monstrous bug in his bed. He lay on his tough, armored back and raised his head a little, managed to see, sectioned off by little crescent-shaped ridges into segments of the expanse of his arched brown belly, atop which the coverlet perched, forever at the point of slipping off. His numerous legs, pathetically frail by contrast to the rest of him, waved feebly. Remember, Kafka always had this self-image problem. And so the feeble legs and everything obviously reflect in some ways Kafka's own perception of himself as being physically unattractive and even repulsive, which of course wasn't the reality, but that's the way he saw it. What's the matter with me, he thought. It was no dream. Well, you know what? It was a dream. Why was it a dream? I mentioned it earlier on today. Because if you remember from Freud and our discussion of Freud's concept of the unconscious and his notion of how the dream is a pathway or a slight unlocking of the repressed unconscious and the id, what happens in the dream? you're able to confront certain things that you're not able to confront directly during the daytime because they're too painful or whatever, so you press them. At night, you're not as controlled, and the dreams disclose to a certain degree certain issues that you had been unable to confront, but in a symbolic way, right? That's why dreams have all these different symbols in them that a good psychoanalyst can interpret. So this really is a dream, because let's face it, someone wakes up in the morning, they're turned into a giant bug. First of all, they're not going to nonchalantly say, oh, amazing, look at this. That's not the way I looked when I went to sleep last night. And a bug doesn't think or speak, right? So clearly, this is not a reflection of reality. And as I mentioned also this morning, it's a very interesting combination in Kafka, because what is real and what is unreal merge. There's no clear line between reality and irreality or seriality. And that's what makes a dream, and that's what makes Kafka. So you'll see Gregor Samsa at one moment speaking or thinking or reacting or whatever, and at the next moment he is struggling with being this newly metamorphosized bug. Now, interesting, it describes his little room. There, quietly between the four familiar walls, was his room, a normal human room. The boy was a little on the small side. Over the table on which an array of cloth samples was spread out, Zamza was a traveling salesman, hung the picture he had only recently clipped from a magazine and set it in an attractive gilt frame. It was a picture of a lady in a fur hat and stole, sitting bolt upright, holding in the direction of the onlooker a heavy fur muff into which she had thrust the whole of her forearm. All right, now, talk about Freud. Well, you can't get more Freudian than this. But what about that? So, who cuts a picture out of a magazine of a strange woman and then puts it in a fancy frame and then puts it on the hangs it in the wall of their room? Obviously someone very lonely, right? Someone without a friend. So it becomes the imaginary friend, right? You take a picture, cut it out and hang it up, and at least, there's someone there, even though you might not know who it is, but it's not like you're alone anymore. And of course, it's a nice female figure, probably from some fashion shot in a magazine. And how is she described? Very interesting Freudian description, right? So imagine this, imagine the image of this woman. She's sitting there in a fur hat. She's wearing a fur stole around herself. And she's sitting bolt upright, and she's wearing a heavy fur muff, right? I guess nowadays we don't see women with that, but in Eastern Europe, or where it's freezing cold, what is a fur muff? It's a round thing out of fur that's like a tube, and you stick your hands in it to keep them warm. All right, got the picture. Woman in fur, and with her arm thrust all the way into the fur muff. Freud would have a field day with this image. Clearly, it has sexual implications, right? It suggests, obviously, sexual relations, and the arm, the phallic symbol being thrust into the fur. So clearly, this is a lonely guy, sexually frustrated. Now, that might seem far-fetched, but we're going to see later on in the story, when the picture falls off the wall and is in danger of being swept away, just how Gregor reacts to that and how he makes every effort to save that picture. And in fact, how he does save the picture, how he makes sure that it is not removed. There's a lot of various types of guilt in this story. There's the overriding universal guilt, the one I've spoken about already before. It's the guilt of not changing your life. And Gregor Zamza is someone who's not happy, very unhappy with what he's doing. And in the course of the story says many times, you know, I really don't want to do this, but I've got to do it. I got to support the family. My father can't work, whatever. And so he never takes the opportunity to better or change his life. So that's the big universal guilt. But then there are other sorts of guilt that you find all throughout the story. And this is already a lead-in, because a lot of it is sexual guilt, very specific types and various feelings that Gregor has that are improper. And that's going to lead us at the end to why did he call him Gregor, right? And this, I think there's a reason why, historical basis, and we'll get to that towards the end of the story. From there, Gregor's gaze directed itself toward the window and the drab weather outside. Right? Of course, it's drab. Everything is drab in Kafka's writings. There's no description of landscape or space. Again, why? Because when you recognize the moment that you have to change your life, you can't be distracted by stopping to smell the roses. You know, there can't be anything there to stop you. Everything has to be gray and drab, right? And the raindrops are heard clinking against the tin window ledges and made him quite melancholic. What if I went back to sleep for a while and forgot about all this nonsense, he thought. Well, you know what? That's his problem. He's been sleeping, not literally, but sleeping in the sense that he is letting his life go by without changing it, without taking that moment when he could have turned his world around. And in essence, it's like a long sleep. And now he wants, once again, having gotten the wake-up call and seeing what he's turned into, and he still wants to roll over and go back to sleep. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so as not to have to watch his wriggling legs, and only stop before he felt a slight ache in his side, which he didn't recall having felt before. Anyone out there who wants to opine about why that ache in the side might be important? I have a theory, and maybe this is my guilt. I never pursued it fully. And I always wanted to write an essay or an article, because this story, The Metamorphosis by Kafka, is exactly the story of Ivan Ilyich. The parallels are remarkable. And of course, Tolstoy writes in a different style. But in many ways, I think Kafka's Metamorphosis is a surrealistic version of Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich. And as we go through it, you'll see other parallels. I don't think it's a coincidence, but the truth is I went through Kafka's diaries and so on, and I just don't see anywhere where he says specifically that he ever read Ivan Ilyich, because he mentions other authors very often that, you know, he read, so you can make a comparison, or you can, you know, at least have some sort of a basis for, you know, suggesting influence. I just never found it, but maybe it's a coincidence, but quite a coincidence and quite a remarkable a similar line of story plot between these two authors. Oh my Lord, he thought, if only I didn't have to follow such an exhausting profession. On the road, day in, day out, the work is much more strenuous than it would be in a head office. And then there's the additional ordeal of traveling and worries about train connections, the irregular bad meals, new people all the time, no continuity, no affection. Right? We already saw he's got a picture of a stranger hanging on the wall. Guy's desperate for affection. And it becomes much more so as the story goes on and where he directs that need for affection. Paragraph or so later, excuse me, just one second. Let me see if I can get the screen adjusted. Okay, that's better. I think. So he slid back, he's still in bed, hasn't gotten out, slid back to his previous position. All this getting up early, he thought, is bound to take its effect. A man needs proper bed rest. There are some other traveling salesmen I could mention who live like harem women. Sometimes, for instance, when I return to the pension, little guest house, in the course of the morning, to make a note of that morning's orders, some of these gents are just sitting down to breakfast. I'd like to see what would happen if I tried that out with my director sometime. It would be the order of the boot, just like that. That said, it might be just the thing for me. If I didn't have to exercise restraint for the sake of my parents, then I would have quit a long time ago. I would have gone up to the director and told him exactly what I thought of him. He would have fallen off his desk in surprise, all right? So what's happening here? We hear again, this is not what Gregor Samsa wants to be doing, but he feels like he has no choice. Why does he have no choice? Because he thinks his parents are relying on him. What happened? So apparently his father lost his business, and together with the law, he lost everything, no assets anymore. So now Gregor feels, I have no choice. I got to support the family. It's my responsibility. In the process of doing that, he's sacrificed his own life. As it turns out, we find out later in the story, the father wasn't totally bankrupted, and he was certainly capable of doing something to earn a livelihood, because he does. When there's suddenly no alternative and Gregor can't work anymore, he's now a bug, right? The father suddenly gets a nice job, right? So basically, again, this is Kafka's way of saying that you have to pursue that goal which is meant only for you, not be sidetracked and not be seduced into thinking that you're responsible for someone else. There's an interesting parallel here with a very famous modern 20th century German philosopher, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche wrote his theories in many very interesting works that are not typically philosophical formats, right? His interesting way of writing his philosophy through parables and stories and all sorts of things. And one of those famous is the work, Thus Spoke the Zarathustra. And basically, Nietzsche believed that man not only evolved from the ape, but man continues to evolve, or should continue to evolve into something greater, into the Superman, Übermensch. And what prevents man from transcending his present state and becoming something even greater, says Nietzsche, is because he's undermined by pity. He has pity for the next guy. Pity for Nietzsche is a terrible thing, because according to Nietzsche, remember, God is dead. So all the morality of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible and everything else, irrelevant. What does pity do? It makes you take your strength and your efforts and project them on someone else, or use them to help someone else, so you're not going anywhere. It limits your growth and your potential. So, and the person who is the subject or the beneficiary of the pity, he's not going anywhere either, because he's relying on your pity, right? So this is a horrible thing, says Nietzsche. And I think there's a bit of that also in Kafka. The idea that focusing on the next one or feeling compassion for the next one is only undermining your own potential growth. And in the case of Nietzsche's Superman, moving to the next level of intellectual and physical strength and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's what's caused this whole problem. He feels like he's got to do what he's got to do because his father is now unemployed and he's got to take care of the family. So that's where the story begins. I want to make just a couple of other points that will keep you on, but again, it's being taped. You remember in Death in Venice, there were all these threshold scenes where Van Aschenbach is on one side of an arch or one side of a doorway and it suddenly crosses to the other. Or the time of day suddenly dusk suddenly becomes night, or dawn suddenly becomes day, and so on. And the suggestion by Thomas Mann is a metaphor for his transition from one state to one level of being and insight to another. In this story, there are I didn't count them, but there are innumerable references to doors. Doors. Either the doors are closed, or the doors are locked, or the doors are shut, or he's a little bug, he's peering underneath the door, the little space on the bottom of the threshold, into another room. So what are all these doors all about? Well, they're a symbol, a metaphor for what? For the fact he's cut off, he's alienated, he's always on the other side. He wants to be with everyone else, but he's been basically cut off. He's been alienated, he's been isolated, he's been forced to have no contact, no physical association or even emotional contact with other people. He complained about it in the beginning. That's the trouble with being a traveling salesman. You never can develop any real friendships or relationships because you're off the next day to the next place. But that's also true at home. And at home, I guess it's more striking. After all, it's your family. And yet, now that he's turned into this, monstrous bug, they certainly want nothing to do with him. So he's further alienated. But even before that, it's clear from some very interesting little passages along the way that he was pretty much isolated and separated to begin with. Because at one point, he mentions in passing that he used to send these letters to his sister. Why would you be sending letters to somebody you live in the same house with? Right? So again, there's this overriding, feeling of disconnect and alienation that permeates the whole story. And the door is one of those concrete metaphors or symbols for that notion of being separated and isolated. Doors closed, you're on the wrong side, so everyone else is on the other side. And so beware of that as you go through the story. Let me just see whether we should maybe end here, because what I want, you know what? So I hope this was somewhat helpful. Let me just take 2 minutes extra to go back to the dead for a moment. But so what we're going to do is, today's Wednesday, on Monday, we're going to finish the Metamorphosis. And I'll give you I've sort of given you a brief introduction to what the trial is all about, because the last day of class is Wednesday, and that's when we see the movie. In order to avoid any of the problems we've had to now, the movie has actually been posted by IT at Baruch, but I was not able to access it because for some reason it's telling me it's not my user name, which is absurd. It is. So, and when I tried to clarify that with IT, they didn't get back to me. So just in case there's a problem, I don't want there to be a problem, it's the last day. I have the movie version, and maybe we figured it out now, how to play it, and so everyone can hear it. But just in case, maybe, belt and suspenders, maybe we should have someone who's able to get to these movies, very kindly got us, I forgot which one it was in the past. Maybe have that as a backup, just in case. It's the trial with Anthony Perkins, whatever. I'll give you the information. I mean, maybe you'll have no problem accessing it because maybe it'll take your username, and hopefully by Monday I can straighten out, what the problem is, why they want to take my username all of a sudden. But anyway, on Monday we'll finish up the Metamorphosis, and then Wednesday we'll see the movie version of the trial. Now, just quickly to summarize The Dead. I really feel badly with the race through it. A really very moving piece of writing and a brilliant piece of writing. James Joyce was an incredible, I would say, architect of words. And just again, to summarize, it begins, of course, with an ascent. It's the Feast of the Ascension, as is mentioned in the movie in the beginning, when Mr. Brown is walking up the stairs. So everything begins with everyone walking up the stairs, right? Because the party's on the second floor. Everything ends with a descent. Everyone's walking down the stairs. It's the end of the party, right? In the course of the party, there are 3 rebukes that the main character, the English professor, Gabriel Conroy, is faced with. First, there's Molly Ivors, right, his colleague at the university, who gives him an earful because she's a great Irish nationalist and involved with the union movement and so on, and he wants no part of politics. He wants no part of Irish nationalism, and in fact, actually displays a hatred for his own country. So she lets him have it. That's actually it's number 2. Number 1 was when he tried to engage in small talk with Lily, the caretaker's daughter, and says innocently, I guess we'll be getting married one of these days, and she gives him an earful, you know, screaming about the men that are, you know, all palaver or whatever. So those are 2 unexpected encounters that sort of spoil his evening. But the big one is at the end, because at the end, his wife, Greta, suddenly hears Bartell D'Arcy, the tenor, singing this song, The Lass of Aughrim, and she's very much moved. There's something about this song and that's gotten to her. And so she walks slowly down the stairs, heads back to the hotel with her husband, Gabriel, and she's just totally lost in thought. And something is obviously happening. He can't quite figure it out, but then he's usually clueless, right? And when they finally get back to the hotel, he finally says, well, you know, something's wrong, what's going on? And she said, well, you know that song that D'Arcy was singing, The Lass of Aughrim? I said, yeah, what about the song? He said, well, it reminds me of a boy I knew. Really? A boy you knew? Yeah, we were young then, when I used to visit my grandmother in Galway, which is Western Ireland. He said, oh, really? Maybe that's why I want to take that trip that Molly Ivors mentioned with the colleagues, that we're going to go to the Aran Islands in the western part of Ireland in the summer. Maybe you wanted to see him. And she said, no, I can't see him. Why? Well, he died. Oh, really? What was he? You know, sorry. Well, he worked in the gasworks and the utilities. So here's this guy as a professor. And he figures, oh my gosh, I have to compete against the young kids, basically, who worked in the gasworks where I had no education. And yet, my wife, you know, she remembers him and she's really moved. So he starts asking questions. You know, so what exactly was the story here? So, well, you know, we were teenagers, we were kids really. And he was an amazing guy, had a beautiful voice, very delicate, ill. He was not a healthy person. And so the last night, before I went back to Dublin, I was in Galway with my grandmother. All of a sudden, it's raining outside. It's cold. It's miserable. And she hears this little ping of a pebble against the window and walks out onto a balcony, just like the scene in Romeo and Juliet. And there he is. There's Michael Fury, the young man, right, standing down below. And she's hysterical. Are you crazy? You're going to kill yourself. You're going to catch pneumonia. You're going to die. He couldn't, he said, I can't let you leave without seeing you one more time. Obviously, he had a great feeling for her, passionately in love with her. And then Gabriel asked, so what happened? He said, well, I found out not long after that from his relatives that, you know, he did in fact become ill and die. And Gabriel says, so you've carried the memory of this guy in your hearts all these years. And then Gabriel sort of walks to the window and engages in a soliloquy. He's talking to himself. The wife has fallen asleep in bed and it's snowing like a blizzard outside. And he says, wow, what a small part I played in her life. All this time, she carried in her heart and mind the memory of this young man. That must really be love. To which he thinks to himself, you know what? I never felt that. Quite a confession. I never felt that. And this is the guy who was originally going to speak at the dinner that night about the love sonnets of Robert Browning and his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Right. So he can deal with love as an abstract in a book, in a poem, and he describes how he loves new books and turning the pages and holding the binding in his hand. It's almost like a sexual experience for him. It's a passionate encounter, but it's with a book. On the other hand, that kind of an encounter, that kind of a feeling or connection with someone else, that's beyond him. And so he realizes at that moment, you know what? My whole life has been empty. I never felt that way for anyone. And then he starts thinking about the people around that holiday table that night. And he said, you know, there's my Aunt Julia, right? Old, decrepit, right? She's going to die soon. She's going to be around much longer. And then I'm going to have to go there and find words of comfort for Aunt Kate and so on. And then he goes on, you know, they're all going to be shades together with Patrick Morgan, his uncle, and Michael Fury. They're all going to become shades, ghosts. And like the cemetery in Oughterard, where Michael Fury is buried, all of Ireland is covered with snow. It's all one shroud. Everything is covered. They're all dead. All the people at that dinner they were breathing, they're alive, right? But they're dead because they're empty souls. There's nothing there. Their lives were meaningless. They were empty. Their lives were empty. Ireland is empty. The way they describe the cultural scene in Dublin, there's nothing there. It's all in the past. That's why the story is called The Dead. Right? It's not just about one guy who's dead, because the truth is he's very much alive, at least in the memory of Greta Conroy. The ones who are alive, they're the ones who are dead, which is, again, it's the theme you've seen since Ivan Ilyich, right? The death of Ivan Ilyich. You know what? The death of Ivan Ilyich wasn't his death. It was his life. As he died, he came to life, right? So same thing in The Dead. It's, again, another manifestation of an empty life, meaningless and without substance. And that's the theme in every single thing we've been reading from the midterm on. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence. I certainly didn't plan it that way. I'm not that morose a person. It just worked out. But you know what? Like I said earlier on, World War I, it's the course I teach at Lehman. World War I changed the world in so many profound and unfortunate ways, but it trivialized the value of human life. And it changed the entire cultural, social, political scene of Europe, certainly. And suddenly, all the old values, all the old expectations, and so on, they were gone. And so an entire continent, an entire culture sort of lost its substance and its sense of meaning and purpose. And that's why in the modern world, you find writers like Kafka who have found a way to articulate that that loss of meaning, or what the Viennese psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, survivor of Auschwitz, and he wrote a treatise after the war about why some people survived the concentration camps, some people didn't, and he called it man's search for meaning. He called it logotherapy. The ones who survived, even under those horrible conditions, were people who had some goal in mind. They found some meaning, something they could hold on to, and that gave them a purpose and a reason to get up the next day. And so you see in these various works that we've looked at, the same idea, the man's search for meaning. You've got to have some purpose, some substance, some value, some goal in your life, or it really has no meaning. And that's basically, in a nutshell, what The Dead is all about, James Joyce. But of course, there are all of the very subtle and intricate structural aspects of the story as well. Absolutely brilliant writer. So, we'll see each other again on Monday morning. I think what I'm going to do also is perhaps Monday evening, I'll have a Zoom session just for anyone who has questions leading up to the final, you know, or anything that's unclear or anything about how it's going to be structured. And so you have another opportunity, and if there are any questions or anything that need explanation, I can give you one more opportunity to clarify or whatever, because I realize the semester went really quickly, and especially at the end. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little documentary about Kafka's life. It's rather interesting, and if you haven't finished reading the Metamorphosis, please do over the weekend so that we can finish it up on Monday and look forward to the movie on Wednesday. Take care and stay well.